Hello, and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Rise and Fall, the Han Dynasty. They say that those who live by the sword die by the sword. Relatedly, those who live by rigorously punitive legal regimes also die by rigorously punitive legal regimes. That at least is the lesson that Han period historians wanted to teach about the fall of the preceding Qin dynasty. We are told that one of the early uprisings against their power, which culminated in the toppling of the dynasty, was inspired by fear of their penchant for harsh penalties. A group of soldiers was delayed by heavy rains, and simply assuming that they would be unfairly punished, decided to launch a rebellion. Even if this tale is true, it has been preserved to convey a message that the Qin were undone by their ruthlessness and inflexibility. Chafing under oppression, a coalition of annoyed subjects overthrew the Qin. In the aftermath, there was a further contest for power between two rebel leaders, Liu Bang and Xiang Yu. When Liu Bang prevailed and became the first Han emperor, he founded a new city called Qian'an, or Forever Peace. Which was obviously too optimistic, but Han power would be remarkably long-lived. Of course, there had been earlier periods of unified power, not just under the blink-and-you'll-miss-it Qin dynasty, but earlier under the Shang and the Zhou. A mythical figure called Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, was acknowledged as the first to rule over all under heaven. But as we've mentioned before, it was really the success of the Han Dynasty, following the chaos of the Warring States period, that created the expectation that a single authority should rule over China. This is what the Han managed to do between 206 BCE and 220 CE, more or less. We distinguish between the former or Western Han and the later or Eastern Han because Han rule was interrupted after a successful rebellion led by Huang-Lao. He launched his bid for power in 9 CE and ruled the Xin dynasty, meaning New Dynasty, for almost 15 years. After the Han toppled him and resumed power, they moved the capital from Xiang'an to the more eastern city Luoyang, hence the names used for the two halves of Han rulership, each of which lasted for about 200 years. Despite the talk of forever peace, there were not just internal disputes but also frequent conflict and diplomatic wrangling with the peoples surrounding the Chinese heartland. A constant threat was posed by the Xiongnu in the north, whom the Chinese considered barbarians, akin to beasts and birds. Towards the end of the Han period, China was also making military inroads into Korea, penetrating there as far as modern-day Seoul, and into Vietnam. There, a rebellion against the Chinese is said to have been led by two women, the Trung sisters. They led an army with tens of thousands of soldiers and established their own court before being defeated in 42 CE. Going in the other direction, under the Western Han, a man named Jiang Qian spent years as a captive of the Xiongnu, and then traveled around Central Asia, returning to bring intelligence of this region. Under the Eastern Han, there was even an attempt to establish connections with the far-flung Roman Empire, though direct contact was prevented when the Parthians discouraged a Chinese delegation from traveling all the way west. Apparently, though, a Roman emissary did manage to get to the Han court during the time of Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century CE. It turned out that heaven stretched a bit further than originally supposed. What then were the policies used by the Han to keep their realm united and strong enough to repel external attack? We're told that when the first Han ruler, Liu Bang, came to power, he began his reign by repealing nearly all the rigid laws introduced by the Qin. He retained only the death penalty for cases of murder and certain punishments for theft and violence. There's good reason for the Han historians to tell us this. As we've also mentioned before, authors like Jia Yi, who composed Finding Fault with the Qin, and Sima Qian were keen to present the Qin as operating with a ruthlessness recommended to them by legalist thinkers like Shang Yang and Han Feizi. The new dynasty was justified by its more moderate approach. In fact, though, the Han retained many Qin policies, for instance the ranks of honor and privilege used to motivate loyalty and military endeavor. From what we said about this when introducing legalism in episode 51, You might have gotten the sense that the Han were wolves in sheep's clothing, hypocritically endorsing the flexibility and ethical propriety of Confucianism, while in fact ruling as the legalists would have had them do. In practice, though, the situation was more complicated. Across the whole Han period, there was oscillation, compromise, and debate between a politics of strict rule-following and one that allowed the emperor and his officials latitude and personal discretion. To give just one example, in the second half of the 1st century BCE, towards the end of the Western Han, the regime found it expedient to announce a series of amnesties, as if restaging the original Han embrace of lenience and repeal of Qin strictness. It is within this political context that we need to understand the ideological role of Confucianism under the Han. Emperors would make a show of restoring ancient rituals and present themselves as upholding the legacy of the various Zhou emperors, as the Confucians wanted them to do, and they would at least rhetorically, if not in fact, take distance from the merciless practices of the Qin. Even the rebel Huang-Lao justified his so-called New Dynasty in this way, claiming that he was returning to the ways of the Zhou under the tutelage of Confucian scholars. A cynical reading would be that adoption of Confucian ideology was mere window dressing intended to reassure potential rebels that the Han were more benevolent than the Qin. But there's no doubting that Confucianism attained influence and institutional support under the Han. The powerful Empress Dowager Dou spent her life resisting Confucianism. She was an ardent supporter of Huang-Lao Taoism, but close to the end of her life, influential Confucian thinkers made their way into the Han court. As soon as she died, Emperor Wu, her grandson, was quick to establish 5 chairs for the erudites of the 5 classics, with each dedicated to the study of one of the 5 Confucian classics. The following decades would see the establishment of an imperial academy and a bureau for ritual music, further signs of the support being given to Confucianism. Emperor Wu, who oversaw the founding of the academy, wanted the classical scholars to adorn the rigor of the law with their literary discourse, in the words of Sima Qian's Xuji. Note here how the quotation acknowledges the complementarity of legalist strictures and Confucian learning. Nothing embodied that combination more than the famous examination system, whereby scholarly training in classical texts became a path to government employment and higher office. By the 2nd century, there were some 30,000 students learning this curriculum in the capital Luoyang. This, of course, has enormous significance for the history of philosophy. As in other places and times, from ancient Alexandria to medieval Paris to early modern Iran, authoritative educational texts became the basis for complex and nuanced traditions of commentary. Hence, we have a man like Ma Rong, who was typical of the universal scholars who emerged in the later Eastern Han, writing commentaries on several Confucian classics, as well as fundamental Han period texts like the Huainanzi. This period also saw the production of scholarly apparatus, like glossaries and dictionaries. In short, across the Han period, and especially the later Eastern Han, we increasingly see philosophy taking on a form we might call scholastic, with all the advantages and disadvantages of such literature. The upside was deep expertise in the language and thought of the authoritative texts. The downside was a tendency towards pedantry and excessive subtlety. Another important Han historian, named Ban Gu, the primary author of the History of the Han, wrote, "Scholars apply themselves to hair-splitting arguments in order to escape criticism, and by glib words and ingenious explanations, they destroy the substance of the texts. Their explanations of a 5-word text run to 20 or 30,000 words, to be rapidly superseded by others. Thus, one who in his youth adheres to one classic can only speak about it when his hair has turned gray." With all this attention to Confucianism, we would expect Han emperors to be paragons of virtue, drawing on their own learning and that of their ministers to make fine judgments of benevolent governance. But in real life, rulers were rather ineffectual. Not infrequently, strong personal rule was a sheer impossibility because the emperor was a young child. There was no established rule that an emperor should be succeeded by his oldest male child, so interested parties, for instance, the widow of the previous emperor or a powerful minister, might pass over adult members of the royal family and instead place upon the throne someone who needed a diaper to avoid soiling it. This is one reason that, as one history of the period puts it, only in a few rare instances can it be shown that a Han emperor was personally responsible for initiating policies or guiding the destinies of the dynasty. Perhaps the legalist thinkers were right to be pessimistic about the capacities of rulers, thinking that most would be mediocre. To some extent, the emperor could even be said to rule at the pleasure of the officials and military men who actually ran state affairs, another nightmare of the legalists come true. As was frankly remarked by a supporter of the first Han emperor, Liu Ban, in present times it is not only the sovereign who selects his subjects, the subjects also select their sovereign. Warring States philosophy offered a perfect rationale for the non-ruling type of rule that was in practice available to Han emperors, the doctrine of wu wei, or non-action. As we know, this idea does feature in Confucianism. Remember the image from the Analects of the ruler who simply sits facing south. But it's especially associated with Taoism, which needs to be factored into our story along with the tensions and compromises between legalism and Confucianism. According to our indispensable historian, Sima Qian, wu wei was fundamental to the teaching of a philosophical movement he calls Huang-Lao. That's Huang as in Huang Di, the legendary Yellow Emperor, and Lao as in Lao Tzu, the author of the Taoist classic of the same name. This name carries with it, then, a suggestion of Taoism that has been given an explicitly political spin, which is not entirely misleading, given that the early Han rulers, including Empress Dowager Dou, are also said to have favored Huang-Lao thought as offering a compelling vision of a flourishing life. Aside from claiming to carry on the legacy of the Yellow Emperor, and with it the mandate of heaven, the Han ruling class claimed to practice wu wei and to follow the Tao of nature in their style of rule. But Huang-Lao was more than just an explicit application of the implicit political messages of the Lao Tzu. Sima Qian describes it as drawing together a remarkably eclectic array of traditions, as if it were a tapestry woven from all the threads of Warring States philosophy. It is a form of Taoism, he says, but one that is grounded in the overall harmonies of the yin-yang school, selects the best from the Confucians and Moists, and picks out the essentials of the schools of names and law. In keeping with this comprehensive list of inspirations, Huang-Lao thought has been detected in a whole range of texts. For instance, some chapters of the Zhuangzi are thought to represent the Huang-Lao approach within Taoism. Another eclectic work, called the Guanzi, has been termed a treasury of Huang-Lao ideas, and a major treatise from the Han period, called the Huainanzi, is also thought to draw on Huang-Lao. Then, we have the summaries of Huang-Lao philosophy in the historians Sima Qian and Ban Gu. To complete, and also complicate, the picture, in 1973, a manuscript written on silk, known as the Bo Shu, was uncovered in Hunan province, containing 2 versions of the Lao Tzu and 4 other works, which have sometimes been identified as a corpus associated with the name of the Yellow Emperor. Randall P. Perenboom is among several scholars who have used this manuscript as a central witness for Huang-Lao thought. For Perenboom, the dominant styles of thought within the text are Taoism and legalism, merged in a way that cannot be found in either Zhuangzian Taoist philosophy or in Fa thinkers like Han Fei. On his interpretation, the defining feature of Huang-Lao, or at least this version of Huang-Lao, is an appeal to nature as a source and justification for human law. He thus speaks of natural law theory. This makes sense of numerous ideas present in the text. For example, like other representatives of Fa thought, the manuscript emphasizes the importance of applying a regime of reward and punishment to prevent wrongdoing. But it adds that this needs to be done in accordance with the cycles of nature, rewards in the spring and summer, and punishments in winter. Similarly, the term shu here means not just sound and effective tactics, as for the Fa thinkers, but tactics that pattern themselves after nature. The successful ruler is one who does not go against the Tao of heaven and earth, like someone swimming against the tide, but who instead follows nature, like the skilled swimmer we met in the Zhuangzi, or the farmer who knows what time of year to plant his seeds. All this gives a distinctive meaning to the notion of Fa, which we can here translate not as law, but as model. The ruler is to model himself and his actions on nature and its Tao. This may sound similar to the legalist Shen Dao's views about Fa being based on people's dispositions and Tao, but as Perenboom states, law in the Bo Shu is natural law, not just politically expedient techniques. As we've seen in previous episodes, neither Taoism nor legalism are well understood as well-defined schools, and that applies no less to Huang-Lao. Still, thinking about Huang-Lao as a tradition that arose during this period is helpful, because it directs our attention to two developments that characterize Han thought more generally. First, a tendency towards eclectic and syncretic thought. For all our doubts about labels that suggest well-defined schools, the Han period will make us yearn for the simpler time of the Warring States, when Confucians were Confucians, Moists were Moists, and Taoists might or might not have been Taoists. As we see with Huang-Lao, and we'll see many times going forward, Han texts resist simple classification and seek to combine the best of the ideas that had been put forward, regardless of school affiliation, while adding new ideas of their own. Second, the idea of grounding human conduct in the model offered by nature. We see that prominently with political applications of the five-phase theory. The color that gave the Yellow Emperor his name indicated that his rule was associated with earth. During the Han, the color of the robes worn at court were chosen to represent one of the five elements. An initial version of this idea was that the Zhou dynasty was associated with fire, and the Qin dynasty didn't count because its short life showed its illegitimacy. Thus, the Han should be associated with the element that quenches and thus follows fire, namely water. With its ascendancy, said one text, the ruler singles out black for prominence among the colors and models his action on water. A neat conclusion given the Taoist fascination with water, whose natural flow was the paradigmatic illustration of Wu Wei. But that did not stop a preference for earth and its color yellow, adopted by the Han court in 104 BCE, while the later Han historian Ban Gu associates the Han's rule with the phase of fire. This too can be understood as an attempt to delegitimize the Qin dynasty. Its brief time in power did not interrupt the phase of fire, which simply carried on into the Han period. For good measure, Ban Gu records the story that Liu Bang, the founder of the Han, was sired by a dragon, a manifestation of the red god, red being the color of fire. That sounds more like fanciful propaganda than proper history, and even in their more sober moments, the Han period historians could be tendentious. Thus, they heaped scorn upon the Qin and maligned the Fa thinkers for encouraging the supposed cruelty of that dynasty. And they cleverly used history to deliver messages to the rulers of their own day. So, one might well lament our dependence on figures like Sima Qian for so much of our knowledge of warring states and early Han thought. But there's another more optimistic way to see this situation. Instead of seeing the historians as mere witnesses, and unreliable ones at that, we could try to understand them as thinkers in their own right. That's what we'll be doing next time as we tell the story of the Han historians, who themselves put the story in history, here on our own History of Philosophy in China.